Hey class, in this video we are going to be going over some CSS layout. So this is our final CSS lesson. We'll just go over a few of the basics. Again, it's not a very in-depth overview. We're just going to cover a few different things that we can do to change the layout and some basic setup stuff. Um, so let's get straight into it. I've got my browser open, I've got Sublime open, and ready to get started. So one of the sort of basic things when it comes to layout, layout basically consists of a couple things. One is the relationship of different elements to each other. So for example, in the document, we have our H1 up here. Let's use a different color. We have our H1, we have our paragraph, we have some paragraphs, and then we have some anchor tags. And so part of the layout is the relationship of these elements to each other. So for example, an anchor tag can be inside of a paragraph tag, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But a paragraph tag, you can see, makes space between itself and other paragraph tags. Same thing with our H1. So most of our elements are either going to be block level, meaning that they take up an entire block of the website. So, we don't see like this text coming up over here because both the H1 here and the P tag here, these are both block level tags. And so they kind of space out and they kind of go down the page by default. And so most HTML pages, at least in most websites, they're going to scroll down. So even though we don't have that much content here, if we went to a page with more content, like our blog or something like that, normally you're scrolling down the page rather than to the right or to the left. There are websites and you can set it up so that you scroll in different directions, but generally the content sort of flows down the page. So there's the relationship of the contents to each other, and then there's the sort of like overall layout of the page. Like this page has very small margins. There's nothing sort of, the text goes almost all the way to the edge of the margins on the top and right and left. There's only one column, and everything is just kind of flowing down here. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with the layout. Some are more complex, some are more simple. We're going to go over just a couple of the basics. So first, we'll talk about the relationship of elements to each other. And actually, let's draw a little bit more. So in HTML, all of our block level elements, so for example, this paragraph, have a few basic layout components that are referred to as the box model. So the box model just talks about the box around our HTML element. And so the box model consists of a few things. The inside is the content. Okay, in between the content and the outside is the padding. So there's a little bit of padding here. Then outside of there, we have a border. Okay, so the border is between the content, or the padding and the content, or sorry, after the padding. And then finally, at the edge, we have a margin. So we have four different things that we can sort of use, and then we can kind of play with how those things interact with each other. And this creates space between the HTML content and everything around it. There are a bunch of defaults for this, and so when we're writing CSS rules, sometimes we're overwriting some of the defaults. But let's take our H1, and since we only have one of those, let's kind of look at some examples here. So our basic content is going to fit whatever text is there unless we restrict it. So for example, I can set the width of the content. So if I said the width is something like 100 pixels, you can see it's squishing the content together. And when we deal with layout, we often deal with pixels as kind of a unit, how many pixels on the page. And so if we highlight our H1, now you can see the width is just 100. So you can set the width of the content, and that's going to restrict, the text, how far it can go across the page. And so if I make that width bigger, we can do that. We can also restrict the height. So if I say the height is like 10 pixels, you can see that the text actually stays the same. So the text kind of floats around the H1. We can't actually change the text, although there are ways to do that, but we're not going to worry about them for now. But notice that the paragraph below the H1 just kind of gets closer as we take away the height. So that's a couple things we can do with our content. We can change the width and the height of the content. Another thing we can do, so you'll notice that when I click on my H1, it kind of highlights over here. And that blue color that is over the text, that represents the content. The orange color represents the margin. And so if I make a rule and I say I want the margin to be 0, now we can see there's no margin and there's less space around the text. So the margin spaces the text out from the rest of the content. So if I take the margin and I say I want it to be 400 pixels, now we can see we have this really big margin. It's probably too big. So let's try 20 pixels. So now we can see our margin, as we make the margin larger, it spaces out the content. The next thing that we have going in from the margin is the border. So we don't have a border right now, but if we add a border, you need a few properties for the border. And this is a good example of sometimes in CSS we combine properties, and this can be a little confusing because you have to combine them in the right order. But if we put these properties in the right order, we'll see a border. So with the border, we have to do the size of the border, the style of the border, and the color of the border. So for the border, for the size, I'm going to do 5 pixels. And then for the style, I'm going to do solid. That just means a solid line. And then for the color, let's do blue just to make it stand out. So there we have our border. So you can see now I have the content, I have the border in between the margin and the rest of the page, and then I have the margin. And then finally, we have padding. This can create space between the content and the border. So for my padding, let's say I do 20 pixels. You can see now the padding, when we highlight it, is green. So that padding creates space. One of the things that's a little tricky about the box model is the way that we write rules. So when we're writing a box model rule, there's a few different ways to write it. One is, and it works kind of like a clock. It goes clockwise. So we can think of the box model. We have the top, bottom, right, and left. And when we're writing rules, we can specify one direction. So we could say margin dash top to only affect the top. Or we can combine them together. So if I say just plain margin, it'll apply to all 4. So if I say the margin is 20 pixels, then the top, right, bottom, and left will all be 20 pixels. But we can also put 2 values. So if I put 2 values, if I say like 10 pixels and 20 pixels, then the top and the bottom are going to be the first 2. So the top and bottom go for the first one. And then the second one applies to right and left. So it's kind of using the top and bottom and right and left as separate ones. And then we can also do 4 in a row, but we don't really need to do that. So let's skip that for now. So let's see an example of that. So my margin here is 36 pixels, and you can see if I increase that or lower it, it goes the same amount. If I do margin and then let's say I just want a top margin. I can say margin dash top and then say 20 pixels. And now you can see it's only applying a margin to the top of the box. And then if I say something like margin is 20 pixels and 40 pixels, now you can see the margin. Oops, I have to set this back to margin. Okay, so now you can see the margin on the sides is bigger than the margin on the top and the bottom. So there's a lot of different ways to write this, which is why CSS styling can get kind of confusing. But let's just put in a few basics for our header just to make it stand out for the rest of the page. So now that I've tested some stuff out, I'm going to go to my CSS page. And I'm going to go to the H1. And I'm going to add a border. So I'm going to say border, and let's say I'm going to do 4 pixels instead of 5 pixels, just make it a little smaller. And I'm going to do solid again. And for this one, let's use the color of the text. So I'm just going to use the same color so it matches. And I think that's going to look nice. And so that looks nice, but the text looks weird because it's really close to the border. So why don't we go back in and let's add some padding. I'm going to add some padding, and I'm going to add padding all the way around in the same amount. So maybe I'll add 10 pixels of padding, and we'll see how that looks. Okay, so that looks much better. There's more space. It's more easy to read the text here. Another thing you might want to do with the layout is now that we kind of have this nice border and that takes up kind of the block of the page, it looks a little weird to have the text over on the left. We can center the text if we want, and this is using a property called text align. And we can say center, and now our text will be centered. That looks a little bit better. It kind of depends on what you're going for. You might not want to have a border, but I think this looks good. And then another thing that we can do with our box is we can round the corners. So these days, the style is much more for rounded corners. If you see like the iPhone or most websites these days use rounded corners. Even the tabs on Chrome use rounded corners. So rounded corners are not necessarily better, but it's very common. So if we wanted to do that, we could say border radius. And let's match the border. So we'll say 4 pixels. And so now we get a nice little radius. I think that's actually a little too little. Let's try 8 pixels. Okay, so that looks kind of good. So there we go. So we can add a border. We can kind of style the border. Again, there's a lot more that you can actually do with the border. You can put images in it. You could put like a animated thing in it. But we're just going to try to keep it kind of simple. So there we can style our text a little bit more. So again, that's one way of doing layout, is sort of working with one individual element. But another way of doing layout is to try to kind of contain stuff or kind of like work with the page as a whole. One thing that is not great about this page is that the text fills up the whole page. So it's not very readable. Usually when we read some text, we want it to be in a smaller column so we don't have to read as far across. And so to do that, we can restrict the width of our page, but to do that, we need to kind of put our content into something that we call a container. So we're going to do that. We're actually going to add some HTML. And so what we'll do is we could actually do this with the body, but it's not a really good idea to do that, because if your site gets more complicated, then you're applying this rule to everything on the site. So what we're going to do is we're going to add an extra element called a div. A div is just kind of a generic element. It stands for like a division, and it kind of comes from layout where you have like different boxes in different places on a website or a magazine. So we're just making a separate division. And a division is just an element that doesn't have any content in it, but it contains other content, and then it styles it, and it's very useful for layout. So I'm going to make a div, and usually when we make a div, because you might have a lot of divs, and I'll show you an example of this in a second. Let's actually undo that for a second. Let's actually look at an example of this first. So let's go back to our schedule page on the Open Lab, and I'm just going to open the source here. And what you're going to see is there are a lot, once we get kind of past all these styling, and there's a lot of stuff in a WordPress page, but here's the body section. So let's zoom in on this a little bit. Okay, so there's the body section, and here we go. Here's a div, and here's another div, and here's another div, and then we have a header, then we have another div, we have a paragraph, another paragraph, we have a nav. There's some more complicated stuff, but see how many divs there are? There's tons and tons of divs. Anytime we want some styling or structure that is not just a regular piece of content, we're going to have a div. So here's a div inside a div, another div. There's just divs everywhere. But one thing with a div is it's a generic thing. So we can add styles to it, but in a complex website, you're going to have tons of divs. So to add styles to just this one div, we need to give it an attribute that we can select in CSS so that we're only selecting this div and not all the other divs that we might have on the page. And that selector is called an ID. So an ID is sort of like your own, you can think of an ID for yourself. Like you have an ID number for CUNY, you have an ID number on your driver's license, you have a social security number. An ID is just like a unique identifier for one thing. So if something has an ID on an HTML page, it should be the only thing with that ID. And you can give anything an ID to style this way, but we're just going to do this with our div. And we're going to call this our container. So this is going to contain all the rest of the code on the website. So for this div, we're going to close it all the way down here at the bottom of the page, so all that content is stuck inside there. And when we do that, we want to move all that content over. This is just a visual thing, but it just makes our page easier to read. So I'm going to go up to all the content and just hit the tab button to move it over like this. So that way we can see where the div starts and ends, and it makes it much easier to understand how our web page is structured. So notice in Sublime, when I click on an element, it shows me where the closing element is. It kind of underlines it. And so if you have an element and you don't see where it closes, you might be missing a closing tag. In Sublime, you can also collapse or fold certain sections. So if your website gets really big, you can collapse different sections and work on one part at a time. That's really convenient when you're working on like a very big code base. I do that a lot when I'm working on my own projects, but our website is pretty small, so we don't really need to worry about that too much. Anyway, so I've got my ID container. Let's go back to style.css, and I'm going to put this, let's see, let's put this right under the body. So to select an ID, we use a hashtag. So the hashtag is just a shorthand in CSS for ID. And then I'm going to say container. Okay, so now I'm going to be able to style this. So let's go back to Chrome. I'm going to try a couple styles out before I write them in my CSS. So I'm going to refresh this page. And now you can see this container, and the container's got my whole content in it. And so let's try out a couple styles for the container. So what I want to do with the container is make the page a little bit more readable. So I want to condense it a little bit. So I'm going to try setting the width. And let's say the width is going to be 600 pixels. Okay, so if I set the width to 600 pixels, what you'll notice is that it doesn't fill up the whole page anymore. When I move the inspector around, it stops moving. So that's great. I don't have this like moving text, and it doesn't get too big, so I can't read it. I think I could go smaller than this actually, but let's leave it. Actually, I think it's a decent size because our header fits pretty well in there. But the only problem with this is that the content is all stuck to the left. It's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but we might want the content to be centered. You might think, oh, I can just do text align center. But that only aligns the text to the center. It doesn't actually change where the content sits. So this is where we use one of the more common rules that you'll see. We're going to set the margin, but we're going to use a special value. So I'm going to set the margin 0. Remember, 0 is the top and the bottom. But then for the left and the right, I'm going to use auto. And what this does is it automatically calculates the margin on the left and the right to fit the window of the browser. So there's different places to use this, but this is really nice because now our content stays centered. But if we make it smaller, it doesn't get too small, it doesn't get too big, it stays in one place. So there's just a couple rules for the container, but they add a lot to my project. So I'm going to go back to my CSS, and I'm going to put these in. So I'm going to say the width is 600 pixels, and I'm going to say margin is 0, top, bottom, and auto left and right. So that's looking pretty good. The one issue that I'm going to run into is if I go to my animator and my coder pages, they don't have that extra HTML. So we're going to have to add those in there to make sure that they all match. So if you add some HTML that you use for your layout, you need to make sure to update the rest of the site. So with the CSS, it's going to apply automatically, but of course, if it's relying on HTML that doesn't exist, then we're going to have an issue. So I'm just going to copy this container and go to animator.html and paste this over here. I'm going to save that. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. Okay, so now I've updated all my pages so they use that container. And there we go. We've got some decent layout for our site. So it's still very simple. There's nothing too crazy. I'm not doing like columns or any wild stuff. But it's a good enough to get us started with some basics and get a website that looks a little bit more modern. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to go over submitting the next version of this project. Next week, we'll go over embedding media. And depending on how that goes, I may throw in a couple CSS things here and there just to make things look good when we do that. But let's go ahead and submit our new version of our website. So once you've gotten to a good place where you've done your edits and you're happy with how things look, we want to update our GitHub. So I'm going to go over to GitHub, and we've got to log in, and then I'm going to look for my web spring 2025 repository. And so remember to update GitHub. All we have to do is drag and drop our pages onto this site. So anything that's new here, we can just drag and drop. And we want to make sure that we're dropping it in the place where we want it to be updated. So let's add our style.css. That's a new file. And let's add our story. Okay, so we can see all the changes that are going to be made here. And we're going to say adds CSS and click commit. And it's going to process for a second. And now we can see we have 3 commits. And so we can see our new commit here. It's still processing our pages. But one of the fun things about GitHub is you can actually see the differences between your old and new version. So you can see the green text or the green highlights are things that we added. The red highlights are things that we've removed. And so we can see all the changes that we made from our previous version, which is kind of fun. And so our pages is still building. So while that's going, let's go ahead and document our new website design and then create an OpenLab page. So I'm going to close the inspector over here. I'm going to pop this window out to just document it on its own. And here, if you're on Mac, you can use the screenshot tool. If you're on Windows, I'm going to use the Xbox game bar, but you can also use the snipping tool. If you have any questions about how to document a screenshot, just let me know and we can go over it. So I'm going to hit Windows G, and this isn't going to show up as we realized on OBS. So I'll just talk through what I'm doing. So I hit Windows G, and that brings up the Xbox game bar, which lets me stream or document video games, but we can use it for other projects as well. And in the capture window, there's a big camera button. So I'm just going to click that to take a screenshot. It's going to take a screenshot of the project of the window that I have open, which is my website. And then there's a little folder or there's a little button to say see my captures. That opens the gallery. And then there's a folder button, which will open up my gallery in the File Explorer. And we should see the image. There it is. Okay, so there's the new image of the website. And so that's what I want to put on the Open Lab. So I'm going to go to the Open Lab. I'm going to scroll up to the top and make a new post. And I'm going to say adding CSS to my website. And I'll just drag this image on here. And so we see my new beautiful website. And I'll say I added a CSS style sheet to add styles to my website. And then we'll just add a link to the project and to the code. So it looks like it's all done. And so we can see the project here. So let's put a link there. So I'll say, here's the live state. And then I'll say, here's my code. And for my code, I'll just link to my GitHub. So I'll go to this code section on GitHub where I see my code here, and I'll copy this and paste it there. And so that's everything that I need to do for blog post 8. And I need to choose the category. So let's go to the categories, say website and weekly blog post. And then we'll click publish. And yeah, so that's our blog post 8. So next week we will add some media to the website. So we'll look at how we can add images, audio, and video. And you'll have that option in your choose your own adventure story if you want to. If not, that's fine. But we will be using that for the final project, so it's a good thing to practice. But yeah, so you can, keep working on your choose your own adventure story. Feel free to write about whatever you think is going to be an interesting, engaging story. And make some basic styles. They don't have to be super complex, but make something that looks decent. And if you have any questions, of course, about CSS or other stuff, let me know and we can go over it. So then we're just going to copy a link to this post and go back to Brightspace, and we'll look for blog post 8. This is our second website blog post. And remember, for this one, there's no program submission because your code is online, so I can look at it there. And so I'll paste this in here and just click submit. And so yeah, that's it for now. Next week we'll do our last week of our website, and then after that we're going to be working on the final project. So we're getting close to the end. All right. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I'll see you in the next video.